Manhattan, Upper East Side. When Victoria Sterling, CEO of a $4 billion hedge fund, walked into her penthouse and saw the janitor blowing soap bubbles instead of cleaning, she fired him on the spot. "I don't pay you to play games," she snapped, as Jake collected his supplies. But then the impossible happened. Oliver, her 7-year-old son who'd never spoken a word due to severe autism, stood up from his corner, watched the last bubbles float away, and said clearly, "More! Me too." One word worth more than all of Victoria's billions. What followed was a desperate race to find the janitor who'd done in 3 minutes what years of expensive therapies couldn't. But Jake Morrison wasn't just a janitor, and those bubbles weren't a game. They were the key to unlocking minds trapped in silence, a secret he'd discovered while saving his own daughter. Victoria Sterling's penthouse dominated the Manhattan skyline like a glass fortress, 6,000 square feet of minimalist perfection that concealed the most devastating drama a mother could endure. Oliver had been diagnosed with severe autism at age 3, and in the 4 years since, he'd never spoken a single word, never made eye contact, never responded to his name. The best specialists from Johns Hopkins to Mayo Clinic had all reached the same conclusion. Oliver might never communicate verbally. Jake Morrison had taken the janitor position at Sterling Towers out of desperation. A former neuroscience PhD candidate at Columbia, he'd dropped out when his wife died in childbirth, leaving him with baby Emma, who'd been diagnosed with autism at 18 months. The university position was gone, the savings depleted by medical bills, and now he worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. But Jake carried a secret in his janitor's cart, a special bubble solution he'd perfected over years of desperate experimentation with Emma. It wasn't ordinary soap. The formula contained pure glycerin mixed with essential oils in proportions he'd discovered after thousands of trials, based on his abandoned doctoral research on visual stimulation and neural pathways. But the secret wasn't just in the chemistry. It was in the way he blew the bubbles, the rhythm of breath, the precise size and sequence that created visual patterns capable of penetrating the fog of autism. Jake had been cleaning the Sterling penthouse for 3 months, always when Victoria was at work. He'd noticed Oliver immediately, the way the boy sat in the same corner, rocking slightly, staring at nothing. It was painfully familiar. Emma had been the same way until Jake discovered the bubbles. He'd waited, planned, and finally decided to act on a Thursday afternoon when he knew Victoria's meeting would run late. Setting down his mop, Jake pulled out the small bottle from his cart. He sat on the imported Italian marble floor, 6 feet from Oliver, and began to blow. Not random bubbles, but carefully orchestrated sequences. Small ones chasing large ones, clusters that merged and separated, an aerial dance following mathematical patterns that certain minds could perceive. For 5 minutes, nothing. Oliver continued staring at nothing. But Jake persisted, adjusting the patterns based on micro-expressions he'd learned to read. Then, at minute 6, Oliver's eyes tracked a particularly large bubble rotating slowly on itself. His hands, usually rigid at his sides, lifted slightly. Jake intensified the rhythm, creating a cascade of iridescent spheres that filled the air with miniature rainbows. That's when Victoria walked in. The board meeting had ended early, and what she saw made her explode with rage. The janitor she paid to maintain her pristine home was sitting on her $50,000 rug, blowing bubbles like a street performer in Central Park. She fired him with words sharp enough to cut glass, ordering him out immediately, threatening to call security if he didn't leave at once. Jake stood slowly, pocketed the bottle, and headed for the door. But as he passed Oliver, the boy did something unprecedented. He moved toward Jake, not looking at him, but his body oriented in Jake's direction like a plant seeking sun. Jake paused, whispered something Victoria couldn't hear, and left. The silence lasted exactly 37 seconds. Then Oliver opened his mouth and spoke his first word ever. More. Clear, unmistakable, world-shattering. Victoria's knees buckled. Her son had spoken. The janitor she'd just fired had achieved what dozens of specialists with Harvard degrees couldn't. She ran to the door, but Jake had vanished into the New York afternoon chaos. The next 24 hours were the longest in Victoria Sterling's life, and she'd orchestrated hostile takeovers in less time. But finding a disappeared janitor proved harder than conquering Fortune 500 companies. The employment records Sterling Towers had for Jake Morrison led nowhere. The address was a demolished building in Queens, the phone disconnected, the references non-existent. Victoria mobilized resources that would make the FBI envious. Private investigators combed New York. Hackers analyzed security footage. A $100,000 reward was posted for information. But Jake Morrison seemed to be a ghost. Meanwhile, Oliver had stopped eating. He sat in the exact spot where Jake had blown the bubbles, repeating his new word obsessively. More, more, more. The therapists tried to replicate the bubble experience with store-bought solutions, but Oliver ignored them completely, somehow knowing they weren't the right ones. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The building's night security guard mentioned seeing the janitor enter a pharmacy on Lexington Avenue every week. The pharmacist, after much persuasion and a generous donation, recalled that the man bought pure glycerin and specific essential oils, lavender, bergamot, and oddly prickly pear essence. Victoria's head of security, an ex-NYPD detective, connected the dots. These weren't cleaning supplies. A deep dive into medical databases revealed the truth. 5 years ago, a doctoral candidate named Jacob Morrison had been researching sensory processing in autistic children at Columbia. His research on visual pattern recognition and neural pathway stimulation had shown promising results before he abruptly withdrew from the program. The university records included an emergency contact, Morrison's sister in Brooklyn. She reluctantly revealed that Jake lived in a rundown apartment in Washington Heights with his 5-year-old daughter Emma, who was autistic but had learned to speak through what she called Daddy's magic bubbles. Victoria found Jake in his one-bedroom apartment, surrounded by notebooks filled with chemical formulas and trajectory diagrams. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. On the table were dozens of bottles, each labeled with codes only he understood. The conversation that followed shattered Victoria's understanding of the world. Jake explained his doctoral research had been ridiculed by his advisors as pseudoscience. But when Emma was diagnosed and began showing the same nonverbal patterns as Oliver, desperation drove him to apply his theories. The specific bubble formula, combined with precise blowing patterns based on Fibonacci sequences and golden ratios, created visual stimuli that could build neural bridges in certain autistic brains. He'd recognized Oliver's specific type of autism immediately, the same as Emma's. He'd taken the janitor job specifically to help after seeing Oliver's photo in a Wall Street Journal article about Victoria. He'd spent 3 months observing, calculating, waiting for the right moment. The laboratory Jake created in Victoria's penthouse looked like something from a sci-fi movie crossed with a medieval alchemist's workshop. Victoria had cleared out an entire floor, transforming it into what Jake called Project Rainbow Bridge. Digital microscopes analyzed bubble surface tension. High-speed cameras recorded flight patterns. Neurological sensors monitored Oliver's brain waves during sessions. But the real magic happened when Jake simply sat with Oliver and blew bubbles. It wasn't random. Each session followed mathematical progressions based on the Fibonacci sequence, with variations Jake adapted in real time based on Oliver's micro-expressions. The bubbles weren't just soap spheres. They were communication vehicles in a language that bypassed verbal centers of the brain to speak directly to the visual cortex and limbic system. After 2 weeks, Oliver spoke his second word, Jake. After a month, he had a 20-word vocabulary. But more important than words was the behavioral change. He began seeking eye contact, responding to his name, showing emotions that had been buried for years. Victoria watched every session with the intensity of someone witnessing daily miracles. She'd put her empire on autopilot, delegating everything to focus entirely on Oliver's breakthrough. But she also watched Jake, this extraordinary man who'd sacrificed everything for a theory nobody believed in. One evening, as Jake prepared a new formula, Victoria asked the question that had been haunting her. Why had he risked everything to help Oliver? Jake's answer was simple and devastating. His wife Sarah had died believing their daughter would never speak, never knowing Jake would find the solution just 3 months later. He'd vowed no other parent would lose years of their child's voice if he could prevent it. The scientific breakthrough came when Victoria convinced her friend, the head of Mount Sinai's neurology department, to observe a session. Dr. Patricia Chen, initially skeptical, was stunned watching Oliver's brain scans during bubble exposure. Previously inactive brain areas lit up like Christmas trees, creating connections medicine considered impossible. But not all bubbles worked. Jake had mapped 17 formula variants, each calibrated for different neurological profiles. The secret wasn't just chemistry, but extreme personalization. Every autistic child needed their specific bubble frequency. It was like tuning an instrument, but instead of strings, there were neurons, and instead of notes, there were floating rainbows. The day Oliver spoke his first complete sentence, "Mom, watch the bubbles dance," Victoria cried for the first time since her divorce 3 years earlier. It wasn't just the words, but how Oliver said them, with wonder and joy, emotions that had seemed lost forever. Jake, always professional, turned to give her privacy, but Victoria caught his hand. In that moment, between bubbles floating in the Manhattan sunset, something unspoken but profound passed between them. News of the bubble method spread first as whispers through parent support groups, then exploded across social media. An autistic child who'd never spoken suddenly talking after exposure to special soap bubbles? The story was too fantastic to believe, yet the evidence was undeniable. The medical establishment attacked immediately. The American Academy of Pediatrics issued warnings about dangerous pseudoscience giving false hope to desperate families. Prominent neurologists wrote scathing op-eds in the New York Times. Late-night comedians mocked the idea with cruel sketches of doctors prescribing bubble baths for everything. But Victoria Sterling didn't become a billionaire by backing down from fights. She transformed the battle for Jake's method into total war, deploying every resource of her financial empire. She funded independent studies at MIT and Stanford, brought in families Jake had secretly helped over the years, produced irrefutable video documentation of Oliver's progress.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like, and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
When the medical board tried to shut down Jake's work for practicing without a license, Victoria's legal team descended like an army. They argued Jake wasn't practicing medicine but conducting private research, protected under academic freedom laws. The turning point came unexpectedly. During a live CNN interview where Jake was being attacked by a panel of experts, Oliver walked onto the set. Victoria had brought him, hoping his presence might help. Looking directly into the camera, the 7-year-old who'd been completely nonverbal 4 months earlier said, "Dr. Jake taught me to talk with bubbles. Before, I was lost in the dark. Now I see rainbows everywhere. Why don't you want other kids to see the rainbows too?" The studio fell silent. The video went viral within hours, generating millions of views and shares. Families with autistic children worldwide began contacting Jake, begging for help. But fame brought problems. Scammers began selling fake miracle bubble kits online. Desperate parents spent fortunes on useless imitations. Jake received death threats from extremists accusing him of giving false hope, and heartbreaking letters from families for whom the method didn't work, because it only worked for about 30% of children on the autism spectrum with specific neurological characteristics. One night, working late in the lab, Jake collapsed. The pressure, the expectations, the weight of all those families placing impossible hopes in him was crushing. Victoria found him curled among his formulas, shaking. Without words, she held him while he cried years of frustration, pain, and loneliness. In that moment of shared vulnerability, their relationship shifted. They weren't just the desperate mother and the janitor scientist anymore. They were two people who'd found in each other an anchor in a world that had hurt them deeply. The kiss that followed tasted of tears and hope, of battles lost and wars still to fight. 6 months after Oliver's first more, Victoria's penthouse had transformed into the epicenter of a quiet medical revolution. She'd converted the entire building's top 3 floors into what was now officially called the Morrison Center for Neurodiversity Research. 30 researchers worked full-time to decode and standardize the bubble method, while a separate wing housed 20 children selected for the pilot program. Oliver had become the center's unofficial ambassador. At 7½, he not only spoke fluently, but showed extraordinary abilities in mathematics and pattern recognition. Abilities Jake theorized had always been there, just blocked by the inability to communicate. He helped with younger children, showing them how to listen to the bubbles, how to follow their dance, how to find words hidden in the rainbows. The medical opposition fragmented when prestigious universities began publishing peer-reviewed studies confirming the method's effectiveness in specific autistic subgroups. Dr. Chen from Mount Sinai became Jake's fiercest advocate, publishing a groundbreaking paper in Nature Neuroscience describing the neurological mechanisms activated by the bubble sequences. But Jake's real personal victory came on a November morning. Columbia University, under international pressure and facing irrefutable evidence, not only reinstated him to the doctoral program, but offered him a full professorship. Jake accepted the position, but refused their apologies. He didn't need them anymore. He had something far more precious. The relationship with Victoria had evolved into something deep and complex. It wasn't a typical romance. It was a partnership forged in battle, cemented by their shared mission to change the world for neurodiverse children. They'd moved in together, not for convention but from practical necessity, working 18 hours a day, often falling asleep exhausted on the lab couch, with Oliver covering them with a blanket and whispering, "Good night," before putting himself to bed, proud of his new independence. One evening, during a rare break, Victoria took Jake to the penthouse roof. Manhattan glittered below them, and in the cool November air, their breath forming small clouds, almost like bubbles, Jake noted with a smile. Victoria made the strangest and most perfect proposal. She didn't ask him to marry her. She asked him to co-found a global foundation to bring the bubble method to every corner of the world, where an autistic child waited to find their voice. Jake's yes came with a demonstration. He pulled out his special bottle and created a single perfect bubble that floated between them, capturing the city lights in its surface. When it burst, it seemed to release not just air, but years of suppressed dreams finally taking shape. The Rainbow Bridge Foundation was registered the following month with an initial endowment of $100 million from Victoria and a promise to dedicate every future profit to research and free treatment for families who couldn't afford it. But the real capital wasn't money. It was the hundreds of families already benefiting from the method, the children finding their voices, the parents rediscovering hope. 5 years after that fateful afternoon when Victoria fired Jake for blowing bubbles, the world had changed in ways no one could have predicted. The Morrison Center had branches in 23 countries. The bubble method had been refined into a scientific protocol recognized by the World Health Organization, and thousands of children had found their voices through floating rainbows. Oliver, now 12, had become the youngest speaker ever invited to give a TED Talk. His speech, titled The Secret Language of Bubbles, brought a room full of hardened neuroscientists to tears as he described being trapped in a mind that couldn't communicate with the outside world. and how Jake's bubbles had built bridges where there were only walls. But the most emotional moment came during the opening of the new children's hospital that Victoria and Jake had fully funded. The Sarah Morrison Children's Neurological Center, named after Jake's late wife, was the world's first facility designed specifically for neurodiverse children, with sensory rooms, bubble laboratories, and a revolutionary approach integrating traditional neuroscience with validated alternative methods. During the ceremony, a 4-year-old who'd entered nonverbal 3 months earlier walked onto the stage. With a trembling but clear voice, he spoke his first public sentence. "Thank you for teaching me that silence isn't forever." The applause lasted 10 minutes, but Jake didn't hear it. He was focused on Victoria and Oliver, his impossible family, and the awareness that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin with the simplest gesture. That evening, in the penthouse that now also housed Jake's daughter Emma, who'd become Oliver's best friend and constant companion, the blended family had dinner together. Emma, now 10 and thriving, was teaching Oliver to play chess while explaining her latest theory about bubble physics. Victoria and Jake watched their children with the quiet satisfaction of parents who'd fought through hell to give them this normalcy. But the story didn't end there. In the lab beneath the penthouse, Jake was working on Phase 2 of the project, not just helping autistic children communicate, but fully decoding their unique way of perceiving the world. Early research suggested that what we call autism might actually be a different and potentially superior form of information processing, blocked only by our inability to provide the right communication interfaces. Late one evening, as Jake worked on a new formula, Oliver entered the lab. Without speaking, he took a bottle and began blowing bubbles. But these weren't random bubbles. They formed complex patterns Jake had never seen. When asked what he was doing, Oliver smiled and said, "I'm writing. It's a letter for all the kids still in the silence. The bubbles will carry it to them, through the air, through the light. It'll tell them there's hope, that someone's coming to build bridges to them." Jake looked at his son, because that's what Oliver had become, and saw not a child recovered from autism, but a complete human being who'd retained the gifts of his neurodiversity while acquiring the tools to share them with the world. This was the real revolution. Not curing autism, but creating a world where autistic minds could thrive and enrich us all with their unique perspective. The final scene of the Oscar-winning documentary showed Jake and Victoria in the penthouse garden they'd created on the roof, surrounded by hundreds of children blowing bubbles. Each child had their personalized bottle, their unique formula, their special way of creating rainbows. Oliver and Emma were at the center, directing this silent orchestra of light and soap, while parents watched with tears of joy as their children finally free to express themselves. Oliver's narration concluded, "People ask if I regret the years of silence. The truth is, I wasn't silent. I was speaking in a language no one could hear. Jake didn't teach me to talk. He taught me to translate. And now, through the bubbles, we're teaching the world that there are many ways to communicate, many ways to be human, and that the real disability isn't autism. It's the inability to see beauty in difference." As the credits rolled, viewers saw flashes of hundreds of centers worldwide, thousands of children finding their voices, and at the heart of it all, a bottle of special soap, and a man who'd had the courage to believe that sometimes the deepest solutions come from the simplest gestures. And in that Manhattan penthouse, as another day ended, Jake prepared a new formula. Because there were still children in silence, still bridges to build, still rainbows to release into the air. The bubble revolution had just begun. Emma looked up from her chess game with Oliver and asked, "Dad, do you think Mom would be proud?" Jake glanced at Victoria, who'd become the mother Emma never knew, and smiled. "She'd be proud of all of us. We turned pain into purpose, loss into hope. And we proved that sometimes a janitor's wisdom is worth more than all the degrees in the world." Victoria added, looking at their blended family. And sometimes, the best things in life come from the people we almost let slip away. If I hadn't been humbled enough to search for you, Jake, Oliver would still be in silence. You saved us all. The last image was of all four of them on the roof, blowing bubbles together as the sun set over Manhattan. A family forged not by blood, but by bubbles, bound not by law, but by love, proving that miracles don't always come from where we expect them. Sometimes they come from a janitor's cart, carrying the secret to unlock silent minds. Hit like if you believe every child deserves to find their voice, whatever form it takes. Comment with the moment that touched your heart the deepest. Share with someone who needs to know that sometimes miracles come in the form of soap bubbles. Subscribe for more stories that show how love and science can change the world, one bubble at a time. Because in the end, what everyone remembered wasn't the millionaire who fired a janitor, but the janitor who proved that sometimes, to change the world, you just need to blow in the right direction.